There are moments in life when betrayal comes from where we least expect it. And when that happens, when someone who was supposed to love us stabs us in the back, something inside us dies. Trust shatters like glass, and we start seeing enemies even in the most innocent shadows. This is the story of a man who lost everything, only to discover what truly matters. And it all began on a pitch-black night when he decided to disguise himself as a homeless man, to test the only person who still showed him any kindness. It was the dead of night in an exclusive, gated neighborhood. Inside a black stretch limousine, a 60-year-old man was adjusting the cuffs of his flawless white linen suit. Arthur was the kind of man life had taught to be tough. Perfectly combed silver hair, rigid posture, a calculating gaze. But that night something different gleamed in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was pain. A deep, agonizing pain, the kind that violently corrodes your soul from the inside out. On the back seat of the limo, a pile of ragged, torn clothes waited for him. Filthy, heavily stained garments, the kind of clothes no one looks twice at on the street. Arthur grabbed a small jar and began working grease into his hair, dirtying it, turning the silver strands into dark, oily clumps. He smeared the grease across his face too, and over his hands, creating layers of grime that mimicked years of living rough on the pavement. Behind the wheel, Joe, his longtime driver and closest friend, watched the whole thing unfold in the rearview mirror with a heavy heart. Joe had known Arthur for over 20 years. He had watched his boss build a massive empire from the ground up, had witnessed his crushing grief when his wife passed away, and was now watching something he never thought he'd see: the total collapse of a good man's trust. "Boss," Joe said, breaking the suffocating silence inside the car. "Tonight's test. Martha's a good woman. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Arthur paused for a second, the jar of grease still gripped in his hand. His eyes met Joe's in the rearview mirror, and there was a chilling coldness in them. But more than coldness, there was a profound, bleeding resentment. "Joe," Arthur replied, his voice tightly controlled, almost a harsh whisper, "after what my own daughter did to me, I don't trust a single soul anymore, especially the people on my payroll. Tonight I'm going to find out if her loyalty is actually real." The limousine glided down the pitch-black road until it pulled over on the shoulder of a deserted highway. Arthur, now completely unrecognizable beneath the filthy rags and greased face, stepped out of the car and dragged himself over to a street lamp. He sat down on the freezing concrete, leaning against the pole as if the gutter were his only place in the world. The limo pulled away, leaving him entirely alone in the darkness. Minutes dragged by. The dead silence of the night was broken only by the distant hum of cars on the interstate. Then, a dim set of headlights approached. It was an old, beat-up sedan with faded paint and one flickering headlight. The car slowed down and parked right in front of him. A woman hurriedly stepped out. She was wearing a faded housekeeping uniform, her face heavily lined by the brutal exhaustion of someone who works their fingers to the bone every single day. It was Martha. Her eyes, however, were incredibly gentle, and in that moment they were flooded with pure concern. "Oh my God, mister," she said, cautiously stepping closer. "Are you all right? Are you lost?" But to understand exactly why Arthur was sitting there, playing the role of a homeless man just to test his own cleaning lady, we need to rewind the clock. We need to expose the gaping wound that was still bleeding out in his chest. Arthur wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He came from a blue-collar family, the son of a factory worker and a seamstress. He learned the value of honest sweat and relentless grit from a very young age. At just 20, he opened a tiny auto repair shop. He broke his back working day and night, weekends, holidays. Every single dime he made was poured straight back into the business. Slowly, the shop expanded. It became a dealership. Then 2, 3, 10. Over 40 years, Arthur built a multi-million-dollar automotive empire that spanned across 5 states. But all that financial dominance didn't bring happiness into his home. His wife, Claire, died of a vicious cancer 10 years ago. It was a completely devastating blow. Claire was the only person who kept him anchored to his humanity, who reminded him that life wasn't just about profit margins and corporate acquisitions. With her, Arthur laughed. With her, he was just a man fiercely in love. After Claire passed, Arthur buried himself even deeper into his work. But there was someone else who should have filled the massive void she left behind. His only daughter, Victoria. Victoria was 35 and everything Arthur had never been. Spoiled rotten, incredibly lazy and ruthlessly manipulative. He knew he carried the blame for that. After Claire's death, he tried to buy his way out of the grief with expensive gifts, luxury European vacations, and black card spending limits. Victoria had never worked a single honest day in her life, and at 25 she married Trent, a man Arthur had despised from their very first handshake. Trent was handsome, incredibly charming, and knew exactly how to spin the perfect lie. But his eyes were dead and empty. He didn't love Victoria. He loved her last name, her 8-figure trust fund, and the lavish lifestyle she financed. And Victoria, blinded by the pathetic illusion of love, refused to see it. For years, Arthur tolerated Trent. He tolerated his pathetic excuses for not holding down a job, tolerated watching him blow absolute fortunes on imported sports cars, designer suits, and endless VIP parties. He swallowed it all because Trent was his daughter's husband. But 6 months ago, something happened that completely incinerated any last shred of paternal love left in his heart. It was his trusted corporate attorney, Dr. Harrison, who uncovered the plot. Victoria and Trent had forged medical documents declaring that Arthur was suffering from advanced senile dementia. They were aggressively pushing for a court-ordered conservatorship to seize total control of his assets. They wanted to legally declare her own father mentally incompetent, just to hijack everything he had bled his whole life to build. The sickening scheme was exposed just in time. The documents were blatant forgeries. The doctors who signed the evaluations were paid-off accomplices. The entire conspiracy blew up in a highly volatile court hearing. Arthur sat there, completely lucid and burning with rage, watching his own daughter cry fake tears and swear to the judge that she was just terrified for her father's declining health. When the judge threw out the case and nearly indicted Victoria for felony fraud, she and Trent scurried out of the courtroom like rats. Arthur hadn't laid eyes on them since. He changed every password, revoked every power of attorney, and permanently cut off her access to his empire. Victoria called incessantly, flooding his phone with voicemails swearing that Trent had brainwashed her, that she was sorry, that she loved him. But Arthur was completely done believing in empty words. That vicious betrayal violently shattered something foundational inside him. If his own flesh and blood, the daughter he raised, was capable of slipping a knife into his back, who the hell could he trust? The paranoia started spreading like a toxic weed through his heart. And that was exactly when his crosshairs locked onto Martha. Martha had been working at Arthur's estate for 5 years. She was a humble, 45-year-old woman, a widow ever since her husband was killed in a brutal factory accident. She had a teenage daughter, Annie, who was 15, and she worked as a housekeeper to keep a roof over their heads. 3 times a week, Martha commuted to Arthur's mansion to scrub, organize, and care for a property that felt way too massive for one lonely man. But Martha was cut from a different cloth than the other staff Arthur had hired over the decades. She wasn't just efficient, she was genuinely kind. Whenever she finished cooking lunch, she always left a hot plate waiting for him on the dining table, even knowing he often worked late. She constantly checked if he was eating well, if he needed anything at all. Sometimes, she'd sit down for a few minutes just to make simple small talk. The weather, a funny story on the local news, her daughter stressing over a big high school exam. Martha treated Arthur with profound respect, but also with basic human decency. She didn't look at him like a ruthless CEO or a walking ATM. She looked at him and saw a deeply lonely man who just needed a little bit of warmth. For years, Arthur silently appreciated it. He never said a word, but Martha was one of the very few people whose presence didn't immediately put him on edge. She was incredibly discreet, honest to a fault, and never once asked for a favor or a raise. She put her head down, worked hard, and left the house spotless and feeling just a little less empty. But after Victoria's sickening betrayal, even Martha started looking like a suspect. The seed of toxic doubt was planted on a Thursday afternoon. Arthur was in his home office, aggressively reviewing contracts, when he heard voices echoing from the living room. It was Martha and Victoria. His daughter had managed to slip past the gates, probably because the new security guard didn't recognize her face. Arthur crept down the grand staircase and hid in the hallway shadows, listening intently. Victoria was sobbing, playing her usual victim card. "Martha, please, you have to help me. My dad is blocking my calls. He cut me off completely. I know I made some terrible mistakes, but I swear I'm so sorry. You've always been so sweet to him. Could you just talk to him for me? Tell him I'm begging for his forgiveness?" Martha, with that unshakable, calm tone she always carried, answered, Miss Victoria, I'm just the cleaning lady. It is not my place to interfere in private family business. If Mr. Arthur is hurting, only you can fix that, not me. But you have his ear, he actually likes you. No, Miss Victoria. I don't have any influence over him. And even if I did, it would be dead wrong for me to get involved. Victoria kept pushing for a few more minutes, but Martha held her ground. She was incredibly polite, but made of iron. Eventually, Victoria stormed out of the estate, slamming the heavy mahogany door behind her. Arthur should have felt a massive wave of relief. Martha had flat out refused to aid his daughter. She had proven her loyalty, but his paranoia was already so deeply rooted that he immediately began to question it. What if it was all an act? What if she's playing me? What if Victoria already bought her off, and that whole conversation was just a staged performance so I wouldn't suspect a thing? Do you realize what happens when betrayal completely obliterates a person's trust? You don't just slowly learn to trust again. You start doubting every single thing and every single person around you. And Arthur, a man who had always prided himself on his razor-sharp ability to read people, was now completely lost in the dark. Fast forward to that freezing night on the side of the highway. Martha didn't hesitate for a split second. When she saw that filthy, lost man slumped against the street lamp, her heart broke with pure compassion. She didn't stop to think about the danger, didn't care what the neighbors might say. She only saw a broken human being who desperately needed a lifeline. "Are you hurt, sir?" she asked, dropping to her knees right beside him. "Can you remember what happened to you?" Arthur, buried under the layers of grime and ragged clothes, stared back at her with hollow, dead eyes. He had meticulously rehearsed this exact expression in the limo's vanity mirror. Pure confusion, sheer terror, absolute vulnerability. I don't know," he mumbled, forcing a violent tremble into his voice. "I can't remember anything. I just woke up on this concrete. I don't even know how I got here." Martha gently rested her hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. Don't panic right now. Are you freezing? Are you hungry?" Arthur gave a slow nod, keeping his face aimed at the pavement. He was feeling something strange bubbling up in his chest. It wasn't guilt, not yet. It was a morbid curiosity, a burning need to see exactly how far this supposed kindness would stretch. "Come with me," Martha said, gripping his arm to help him up. "I'm taking you to my place. I've got a hot meal and a safe spot for you to crash. We'll figure out what to do when the sun comes up." Martha's house was in a rough, working-class neighborhood on the far outskirts of the city, miles away from the gated communities where Arthur resided. The streets were cracked asphalt fading into dirt, and the streetlights were few and far between. The houses were tiny, many with exposed cinder blocks and peeling siding. But there was a heartbeat to the place. Kids playing tag on the sidewalks late into the night, neighbors shooting the breeze on their porches, the rich smell of home-cooked meals drifting out of open windows. Martha's beat-up sedan rattled to a stop in front of a very modest house. 3 small rooms, tops. The exterior paint was aggressively peeling, and the chain-link gate was rusted shut in places. But the tiny front porch was swept spotless, featuring a single potted plant that someone clearly cared for deeply. "This is it," Martha said, pushing the front door open. "It's nothing fancy, but it's what we've got." Arthur stepped inside and was immediately hit by the smell of an actual home. It was a scent his multi-million-dollar mansion hadn't held in over a decade. The smell of dinner simmering on the stove, of freshly laundered clothes, of real, raw life being lived within those 4 walls. A teenager stepped out of the tiny back bedroom. Annie, Martha's daughter. She was 15, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, still wearing her high school gym clothes. When she spotted the filthy vagrant standing in her living room, her eyes went wide with shock. "Mom, who is that?" "I found him wandering the highway, Annie. He lost his memory. He has absolutely nowhere else to go. He's gonna crash here tonight, all right?" Annie looked from her mother to the grimy stranger, and then back to her mom. For a split second, Arthur saw a flash of deep hesitation in the girl's eyes. It was human nature, a completely unknown man in their fragile space. But then Annie looked at her mother's pleading expression and gave a slow nod. "Okay, Mom. I'll go grab the spare blanket." Martha guided Arthur into the cramped, tiny kitchen. A worn pot was simmering on the stove. She ladled out a deep bowl of hearty vegetable stew. It was nothing gourmet, just carrots, potatoes, and a few tough cuts of beef. But it was piping hot and made from scratch. "Eat up, Mr. Peter," Martha said. He had fed her that fake name when she first asked. Peter. Simple, common, completely forgettable. Arthur gripped the spoon, forcing his hands to violently shake. The stew was incredible. True comfort food. The exact kind of meal his own mother used to make when he was a kid. He ate in dead silence while Martha set up a makeshift bed for him. She hauled out a paper-thin foam mattress and dropped it right onto the living room floor. She brought over a worn-out blanket, heavily patched up in several spots but smelling like fresh detergent. She tossed a flat, lumpy pillow on top. "I know it's not the most comfortable setup," she said, offering an exhausted but warm smile. "But it'll keep you out of the cold tonight. We'll sort out your situation tomorrow." Arthur stared down at that pathetic mattress. He usually slept in a California king bed wrapped in 1,000-thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets. That piece of foam probably didn't cost $20 brand new, but Martha was offering it to him like it was the presidential suite. Because to her, it was the absolute best she had to give. "Thank you, Miss Martha," he croaked, his voice thick and raspy. "You are incredibly generous." "Don't even mention it, Mr. Peter. We've got to look out for each other in this world, right? Tomorrow it could easily be me out there needing a hand." She flicked off the light switch and retreated to her bedroom. Arthur lay there in the pitch black, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. He could hear Martha and Annie whispering softly through the thin drywall. He could hear the muffled sirens out on the avenue. He was physically miserable, yes, but something deep inside his chest was starting to aggressively thaw, something he hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Morning broke with the harsh sound of neighborhood dogs barking and kids yelling out on the pavement. Arthur woke up with his spine screaming in pain. His aging body wasn't built for sleeping on a hard floor. Martha was already up, brewing a cheap pot of coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Peter. Did you sleep all right?" "I did, yes. Thank you." She handed him a mug of black coffee and a piece of white bread smeared with margarine. Arthur ate slowly, calculating her every single move. Martha was already zipped into her cleaning uniform. She had to hustle to work. "Mr. Peter," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "I have to clock in for my shift today, but before I go, I'm taking you down to the precinct. We need to file a missing persons report. There's a good chance your family is out there tearing the city apart looking for you. If they filed a report, the cops can figure out exactly who you are." Arthur felt a sickening knot twist in his gut. She was literally willing to risk being late for work, risking her own paycheck, just to help drag him to a police station. He gave a slow nod, keeping his face locked in that hollow, lost expression. The precinct was a few blocks over in an equally rough neighborhood, a decaying brick building with peeling plaster and a blown-out AC unit. The heat inside was absolutely suffocating. The waiting area was packed with a miserable line of people. Martha grabbed a numbered ticket and sat right beside Arthur on the hard plastic benches. They sat there rotting for nearly 2 hours. When their number finally lit up, they walked up to the bulletproof glass where a heavy, sweating desk sergeant was aggressively typing on a keyboard, not even bothering to look up. "Yeah, what do you want?" the cop grunted, his tone dripping with absolute boredom. "Good morning, officer," Martha started, overly polite. "I need to report a found missing person. I picked this gentleman up wandering the highway last night. He has total amnesia." The sergeant finally bothered to lift his head. His eyes did a quick sweep over Martha and then locked onto Arthur. His upper lip curled into a nasty, judgmental sneer. "Lost his memory, huh?" the cop mocked, his voice laced with heavy cynicism. "Funny how that amnesia always seems to kick in right after a massive 3-day bender, ain't it?" Martha felt her blood instantly boil. "No, sir, he wasn't drunk. He genuinely cannot remember his own name," the cop scoffed loudly. "Lady, look at the guy. He's just another street bum. Probably got into a screaming match with his old lady, drank himself into the gutter, and now he's playing the victim. We don't have the manpower to go hunting for the families of junkies who don't even want to be found." Arthur, sitting completely still beside Martha, clenched his fists so hard under the counter his knuckles turned white. He knew men exactly like this. Pathetic little tyrants who got off on the power trip of hiding behind a badge, treating desperate citizens like absolute garbage. If Arthur had been standing there in his bespoke suit, he would have ended that man's entire career with one phone call to the police commissioner. But trapped in that disguise, he was completely invisible, utterly powerless. "Officer, I am begging you," Martha pushed back, maintaining a miraculous level of calm. "I just need you to log him into the system as found. Somebody out there might be crying their eyes out looking for him. Just type it into the computer." The sergeant dramatically rolled his eyes. Lady, the national database is down. Try again some other day. Are you kidding me? You were just typing into it for the guy right in front of us. Well, it just crashed. Next in line. Martha stood frozen at the window, her hands visibly shaking with blinding rage and sheer frustration. Arthur watched the brutal internal war raging inside her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand human decency, but she knew it was a losing battle. People in her tax bracket were entirely invisible to men like that sergeant. "Let's go, Mr. Peter," she finally choked out, her voice cracking. "We'll come back another day." They walked out of the precinct with absolutely nothing. Back outside in the suffocating heat, Martha leaned heavily against the brick wall and took a ragged breath. Her eyes were welling up, fighting a desperate battle not to cry. "I am so sorry, Mr. Peter," she whispered. "I swore I was going to help you, but—" "You already have," Arthur replied, genuinely shocked by the raw sincerity bleeding into his own voice. "You've done way more than 99% of the world ever would." Martha wiped her eyes fiercely and forced a brave smile. "We are not giving up, okay? We'll try another angle. I'll print out some flyers with your face on them. Tape them up at the free clinics, the grocery stores, the churches. Somebody is bound to recognize you." Arthur stared at the woman standing in front of him. She had just been completely degraded by an arrogant city employee. She had burned 3 hours of her shift. She was definitely going to get her pay docked today. And yet, here she was, doubling down on her promise to save a homeless stranger she pulled out of the gutter. For the very first time since he launched this twisted psychological test, Arthur felt an emotion he never saw coming. Blinding shame. But the toxic whisper of paranoia was still hissing in the back of his mind. "It's a performance. She knows exactly who you are. She's playing the long game, just wait. Soon enough she'll ask for a loan, she'll slip up, she'll show her true colors." So he made the brutal decision to keep going, to push the test to its absolute limit. But now a tiny buried part of his soul was desperately praying that he was dead wrong. It's sickening to see someone act with such absolute cruelty toward a person who's just begging for a little help, isn't it? If you are just as outraged by this blatant injustice, hit that like button right now to prove you stand with people like Martha, who refuse to back down even when the world treats them like dirt. The next few days were incredibly bizarre for Arthur. He kept up the charade as Mr. Peter, sleeping on the miserable foam pad in Martha's living room, eating whatever cheap meals she could scrape together, hyper-analyzing every single gesture, every single word she spoke, hunting for the crack in her armor, waiting for the exact second her mask would slip and her greedy intentions would bleed through. But the mask never slipped. Martha remained relentlessly kind, incredibly patient, and entirely devoted to helping him. She taped up Xeroxed flyers with his mugshot at the local free clinics, the laundromats, and the community churches. She stopped neighbors on the street to ask if they recognized his face. She even smuggled leftover food from her housekeeping jobs just to make sure he had enough calories. She treated him with profound human dignity, treating him like he was someone who mattered, not just a nameless vagrant. And that was the exact reason Arthur decided to turn the psychological screws even tighter. On his 5th night crashing at Martha's place, he started coughing. It started out as a weak, dry hack, barely noticeable. But as the hours dragged on into the pitch black, he ramped it up, faking deep, wet, agonizing coughs. He forced his body to shiver, faked brutal chills, and pretended to break into a cold sweat. Martha bolted awake at 3 a.m. to the sound of his violently hacking lungs. She rushed into the living room and flicked on the overhead light. Mr. Peter was curled into a tight ball on the floor pad, shaking uncontrollably, his face twisted in pure, faked agony. "Oh my God, Mr. Peter," she gasped, dropping to her knees right beside him. She pressed her palm against his forehead. Arthur had aggressively rubbed his hands together to generate friction heat, then pressed them to his own forehead just seconds before she walked in. He felt like he was burning up. "I'm freezing," he whimpered, forcing his vocal cords to rattle. "So cold." Martha sprinted to the closets, grabbing every single threadbare blanket she owned. She buried him under them, but he deliberately kept shivering. She rushed to the kitchen to brew boiling hot tea, practically forcing it down his throat. She stayed anchored right beside him for the rest of the night, holding a damp rag to his head, whispering desperate prayers into the dark. When dawn finally broke, Arthur was still putting on the performance of a lifetime. He was coughing so violently it sounded like his lungs were going to explode out of his chest. Martha was ghost pale with sheer terror. Mr. Peter, we have to get you to a doctor immediately. This could be severe pneumonia. You could die. I don't have a dime to my name, Arthur rasped. I know, but I do. I have a little emergency stash saved up. I'm going to use it to pay an urgent care doctor. Annie walked out of her bedroom, still rubbing the sleep from her eyes. When she saw the chaotic scene, she rushed to her mom's side. Mom, is he really bad? He is, baby. I'm taking him to Dr. Marshall, that private clinic over by the strip mall. If we go to the county hospital ER, we'll be sitting in the waiting room for 12 hours. Annie stood completely silent for a second. Then, she whispered in a heartbreakingly soft voice. But Mom, that money was for my back-to-school supplies. The semester starts on Monday. Martha looked at her teenage daughter, her eyes instantly brimming with hot tears. I know it was my sweet girl, but his life is literally on the line right now. We can buy notebooks and backpacks later, a little at a time, but we can't buy a life back. Annie swallowed a massive lump in her throat and nodded. Arthur, lying there faking his deathbed routine, felt a physical dagger twist in his gut. That cash was for her kid, for the girl's education, and Martha was about to blow every last cent on a complete stranger. A couple of hours later, they were sitting in Dr. Marshall's examination room. It was a no-frills, urgent care clinic. Dr. Marshall was a middle-aged guy with graying temples and thick, wire-rimmed glasses. He was also one of the private concierge doctors Arthur kept on his personal payroll. Arthur had called him from his burner phone a few days prior, briefed him on the insane situation, and ordered him to play along with the test. The doctor examined Peter with a gravely serious face. He listened to his lungs with a stethoscope, checked his throat, took his temperature. Martha sat rigidly in the plastic guest chair, aggressively biting her nails down to the quick. Martha, Dr. Marshall finally said, pulling off his stethoscope and dramatically cleaning his glasses. His vitals are highly alarming. It looks like a severe, deep tissue respiratory infection. He needs a battery of immediate tests, chest X-rays, a full CBC blood panel, and likely a CT scan if his numbers look bad. Plus a heavy course of broad-spectrum antibiotics. How much is all of that going to cost, doctor? The doctor took a heavy, calculated pause. The diagnostic imaging and labs will run about $1,200 out of pocket. The pharmacy scripts will be another $300. You're looking at exactly $1,500 total. Martha felt the linoleum floor vanish right out from under her. She had $800 stuffed in a jar at home. It was every single dollar she had to her name. Everything she had brutally scraped together over 6 straight months of scrubbing toilets, just to make sure Annie had the textbooks, the graphing calculator, and the uniform she needed for the fall semester. I only have $800, she stammered, her voice shaking violently. That's not going to cover it, I'm afraid. Arthur, perched on the crinkly paper of the exam table, analyzed every micro-expression. He watched the pure, unadulterated panic consume Martha's face. He fully expected her to finally crack and say, "Then there's nothing else I can do. I'm sorry, Mr. Peter." He expected her human decency to hit a brick wall, just like everyone else's always did. But Martha never said those words. "Doctor," she said, squaring her shoulders, "give me 24 hours, just one day. I will get the cash. I swear to God, just please, hold on for one day." They drove back to the house in total, suffocating silence. Annie was pacing the living room, desperate for an update. When Martha told her the devastating price tag for the treatment, the color completely drained from the teenager's face. "Mom, we don't have anywhere near that kind of money." "I know, baby, but I'm going to figure it out." That afternoon, Arthur watched from the shadows of the hallway as Martha frantically tore her own house apart. She owned virtually nothing of value: a bulky, outdated TV with dead pixels, a prepaid burner phone she needed for her cleaning gigs, a few particle board dressers donated by pitying neighbors over the years. But then, she walked into her tiny bedroom and opened a small, scuffed wooden box sitting on the top shelf. From inside, she pulled out a ring. A completely plain, worn-down gold wedding band. Arthur watched closely as she held that cheap piece of metal up to the window light, and the tears began to stream silently down her exhausted face. Annie saw it from the doorway. "Mom, no, please. That's Dad's ring." "I know, my sweet girl. It's literally the only piece of him we have left." "I know." Martha squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the gold band tightly in her palm. Her voice came out completely strangled, suffocated by decades of grief. "But your father was a righteous man. He taught me that a human life always comes first. That you never, ever let someone die in the dirt when you have the power to save them. If he were standing right here, he would command me to sell it." Annie threw her arms around her mother's neck and sobbed into her shoulder. Martha cried right back, but her grip on the ring never loosened. She wasn't backing out. Arthur stood frozen against the hallway drywall, spying on the devastation. Something massive inside his chest started to violently crack. These weren't just hairline fractures. This was a deep tectonic split, the kind that violently rips a boulder completely in half. She was actually going to pawn her dead husband's wedding ring, the very last physical anchor to the love of her life. For him. For a nameless vagabond she had scraped off the asphalt less than a week ago. The next morning, Martha left at the crack of dawn. She took the bus downtown to a sleazy pawn shop, one of those depressing neon-lit traps where desperate people sell their family histories for literal pennies on the dollar. She slid the gold band across the scratched glass counter. The pawnbroker, a gaunt guy with a nasty scar across his jaw, picked up the ring and squinted at it through a jeweler's loupe. "Solid gold. Nothing fancy. What do you want for it?" "I need $1,000. He barked out a harsh laugh. "Lady, scrap weight on this is maybe $700 on a good day." Martha felt the desperate tears threatening to spill over again. "Sir, I am begging you. It is a literal life or death emergency. A man is going to die if I don't walk out of here with that cash." The broker stared at her with dead, cynical eyes. He heard 100 sob stories a week. They were all just background noise to him. $750. That's my final offer. Take it or walk." Martha did the brutal math in her head. Combined with the $800 in her jar, that put her at $1,550. It was just enough. Barely. But it was enough. "Okay," she choked out, her voice entirely broken. "I'll take it." The guy slapped the grimy bills onto the counter. Martha scooped up the cash, shot one final devastating look at the gold ring that now belonged to a total stranger, and walked out into the street with her heart ripped completely out of her chest. When she walked back through her front door, Arthur was sitting on the floor pad, waiting. She stepped inside, wiped her face, and plastered on a fake, reassuring smile. "I got the money, Mr. Peter. First thing tomorrow morning, we're going to the clinic to get those tests done." But before Arthur could even open his mouth, Annie stumbled out of her bedroom. She was hacking violently, a dry, deep, agonizingly painful cough. "Mom!" the teenager wheezed, her throat raw. "I think I caught whatever he has." Martha bolted to her daughter and slapped the back of her hand against the girl's forehead. She was burning up, blazing hot fever. Annie was severely, terrifyingly sick. The entire axis of Arthur's world stopped spinning. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror detonate in Martha's eyes. He watched her look at her sick kid, then snap her gaze over to him, and then down to the crumpled envelope of cash in her purse. She had exactly $1,550. His fake medical protocol cost exactly $1,500. She would have $50 left over. That wasn't even close to enough to get Annie treated at the clinic too. And right then and there, Arthur watched Martha make the most brutal choice of her life. He saw the ironclad resolve harden in her eyes. She was going to keep her word. She was going to pay for his treatment first. Because she had promised. Because she was convinced his infection was further along and lethal. Because that is exactly the kind of woman she was. "Annie, my beautiful girl," Martha said, her voice impossibly steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You are strong. You have youth on your side. Your immune system can fight this. I'm going to make you strong ginger tea, give you honey. I'm going to nurse you through this. But Mr. Peter's body is failing. If I don't buy him those antibiotics right now, he is going to die." Annie, with fever tears burning down her flushed cheeks, nodded slowly. "I know, Mom. I understand." Arthur felt like he had just taken a baseball bat straight to the ribs. She chose him. She actively chose to save a filthy stranger over getting her own flesh and blood medical care. She literally sold the last physical memory of her dead husband to save a vagrant she met on the highway. She put the life of a homeless man above the medical comfort of her own sick child. If you recognize that true, blindingly pure angels still exist on this earth, smash that like button right now to honor the unimaginable sacrifice of this mother's heart. That night, Arthur didn't sleep a single wink. Lying on that miserable piece of foam in the living room, staring up at the cracked ceiling. The crushing weight of his own guilt felt like a freight train parked on his chest. This psychotic test had gone way, way too far. It had given him the exact proof he demanded, but it proved something far more devastating than he bargained for. Martha was undeniably real. Her soul was pure gold. And he, Arthur, a titan of industry who prided himself on his brilliant intellect and cynical worldview, had been an absolute monumental fool. A cruel, sadistic fool. When the sun came up, the game had to end. Arthur simply couldn't stomach the lie for another second. Not while listening to Annie violently hack her lungs out in the back room. Not while watching Martha desperately brew cheap tea, her hands trembling violently from sheer exhaustion and maternal terror. The test was officially over, and Arthur was the only one who had completely, utterly failed. The days dragged on like heavy boulders. Arthur had kept up the Mr. Peter act, but every single sunrise made it infinitely harder to stomach the deception. He watched Annie coughing in the back room, slowly fighting off the bug with nothing but herbal teas and the cheap drugstore syrup Martha bought with her leftover $50. He watched Martha pulling brutal double shifts, leaving the house before dawn, and dragging herself back long after dusk, destroying her body just to financially recover from the money she blew on him. And with every passing hour, the crushing guilt strangled him like a toxic vine, choking out any pathetic justification he tried to cling to. He had seen enough. He had put this woman through a psychological torture chamber. He had pushed her empathy to the most sadistic, unforgiving limits. And she never cracked. She never wavered. She never revealed a hidden agenda, never demanded a payout, never dropped the mask. Martha was exactly the woman she appeared to be. A good woman. A terrifyingly, sacrificially good woman. And Arthur? He was the actual monster in this horror story. The billionaire who was so deeply terrified of being conned that he became the ultimate con artist. A man so poisoned by paranoia that he engineered a sick trap where an innocent mother sacrificed her husband's ring for an absolute lie. In the dead of night on a Friday, Arthur reached into his filthy jacket and pulled out the encrypted burner phone he kept hidden on him. He dialed Joe. "Joe," he rasped, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "It's over. Come get me tomorrow morning, and bring the stretch limo. It's time she finds out exactly who I am." On the other end of the line, Joe let out a massive sigh of relief. "Thank God, boss. I was losing my mind with worry. I'll be at the curb right at dawn." The next morning, Martha had already left at sunrise to scrub floors. Annie had stayed home from school because she was still nursing the tail end of her fever. Arthur waited out on the tiny concrete porch, staring out at the dirt road, watching the neighborhood kids kick a deflated soccer ball, watching the locals wave to each other across chain-link fences. This broken-down neighborhood possessed something his 50-room mansion had been missing for decades: real community, human warmth, a soul. And then, he saw it. Crawling slowly down the pothole-ridden street, a massive, gleaming black limousine. Looked like an alien spaceship landing in a junkyard, an absolute jewel floating through the mud. The neighborhood kids froze dead in their tracks to stare. Neighbors pushed their screen doors open, jaws dropping. The limo glided to a smooth stop right at Martha's rusted gate. Joe stepped out, wearing a flawless, tailored black suit, and marched straight up to the front door. Annie was sitting on the couch when she heard the heavy, authoritative knock. She pulled the door open and froze, absolutely stunned. A highly polished chauffeur standing in front of a luxury vehicle she had only ever seen in rap videos. "Good morning, miss," Joe said with crisp professionalism. "Is Miss Martha available?" "No, sir. She's already at work." "Is Mr. Peter currently on the premises?" Annie hesitated, deeply confused, but gave a slow nod. "Yeah, he is. Let me go grab him." She yelled toward the back porch. "Mr. Peter, there's some fancy guy out here asking for you." Arthur stepped inside slowly. He was still wearing the filthy rags, but he had aggressively scrubbed his face in the sink before dawn. Most of the engine grease was gone. The sharp, aristocratic angles of his face were finally visible. When Joe saw him, he gave a crisp, deeply respectful bow. "Good morning, Mr. Arthur. The vehicle is prepped and ready for your departure." The dead silence that crashed over that tiny living room was absolutely deafening. Annie turned to stone, her eyes bugged out of her head. She looked frantically from the chauffeur to Peter and back to the chauffeur. "Mr. Arthur?" she whispered, her brain completely short-circuiting. Arthur closed his eyes, took a deep, jagged breath, and nodded. "Yes, that is my actual name, Arthur. At that exact second, the front door violently banged open. Martha had run back home. She had forgotten her packed lunch on the counter and had rushed back to grab it. She burst through the doorway but stopped dead in her tracks the second she absorbed the scene. The luxury limo parked outside. The man in the suit, Mr. Peter, standing upright, and the man in the suit calling him Mr. Arthur. Martha's face cycled through a hurricane of emotions in a matter of seconds. Total confusion, absolute shock, sudden realization, and then a reaction Arthur never in a million years saw coming. It wasn't blind rage. It was pure, unfiltered relief. "Mr. Arthur," she whispered, as tears instantly flooded her eyes. "Mr. Arthur, is that you?" He gave a slow nod, the words completely jammed in his throat. And then, to Arthur's absolute mind-bending shock, Martha collapsed to her knees. Not out of humiliation, not out of anger, out of sheer, overwhelming relief. "Thank God," she sobbed into her hands. "Thank God you aren't really a homeless man dying on the street. Thank God." Arthur felt his heart practically shatter inside his ribs. She was relieved. She wasn't furious that she had been brutally conned. She was just crying tears of joy because the man she thought was dying in the gutter was actually safe and protected. "Martha, he started, stepping forward, but she threw a trembling hand up in the air. "Mr. Arthur, I need to confess something to you right now. Something I have literally never told a single living soul." She dragged herself off the floor, her knees shaking wildly. She ran into her bedroom and rushed back out clutching a heavily yellowed sealed envelope. Taped to the front of it was a tiny brass key. 15 years ago, Martha started, her voice quivering with adrenaline. "When my Annie was just a newborn baby, I worked as a housekeeper for a very wealthy old money woman across town. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor. She was elderly, a widow, totally alone in the world. She lived in this massive estate, but she never had kids, never had a single visitor. I went there 3 times a week to scrub the floors and cook her meals." Arthur felt a block of ice slide straight down his spine when he heard that name, Mrs. Eleanor. "One afternoon," Martha pushed on, "she called me into her master bedroom. She was incredibly sick. She knew the end was coming fast. She shoved this sealed envelope into my hands and said, 'Martha, you are the only person on this miserable earth who treats me like a human being and not just a bitter, wealthy old crone. Keep this hidden. Do not open it unless you hit absolute rock bottom and have no other way out. Swear it to me.' I swore it. She died in her sleep 2 weeks later." Martha's hands were vibrating so violently she almost dropped the envelope onto the floor. "I never broke the seal, Mr. Arthur. Not once. We starved. We got our power shut off, we struggled. But I never felt worthy of whatever was inside it. Until the day before yesterday, when my Annie spiked that fever and I literally had $0 left to my name. I ripped it open." She shoved the letter into Arthur's chest with trembling hands. He grabbed it and started reading the cursive ink. And with every single line his eyes scanned, his jaw dropped closer to the floor. The letter read, "My dearest Martha, if you are reading this ink, it means you have finally hit rock bottom and you are desperate for a lifeline. Do not feel an ounce of shame. I left everything to you. This brass key opens safety deposit box number 847 at the First National Bank downtown. Inside that steel box is the fully paid deed to my secondary estate, heavily yielding stock certificates, and enough liquid cash to guarantee you never have to scrub another floor for the rest of your life. You earned this, my dear. You were the only soul who ever looked at me and saw Eleanor, not just the wealthy, discarded great aunt of the Sterling family. Live a beautiful life. Protect your little girl. With profound love, Eleanor Sterling." Arthur felt the entire room start spinning. Eleanor Sterling, his great aunt. The famously eccentric, reclusive relative that the entire family aggressively avoided because she was difficult and miserable. He himself had only ever visited her maybe half a dozen times in his entire life, always out of pure familial obligation, always checking his Rolex, desperate to leave. She had passed away 15 years ago. He vaguely remembered the funeral. Tiny, depressing, completely empty. At the time, the estate lawyers had announced she left her entire fortune to a domestic employee, but Arthur never bothered to look into it. He just assumed some con artist had manipulated the senile old woman into signing the papers. But it wasn't a con artist. It was Martha. Martha, who was standing right in front of him, physically shaking, tears pouring down her exhausted face. "Mr. Arthur," she choked out, "I never stepped forward to claim this inheritance because I felt like a fraud. I didn't think I deserved a single penny of it. But right now, with Annie being so sick with everything that's happened, I don't know what to do. You are a powerful businessman. You have to help me figure this out. I am begging you." Arthur stood paralyzed in dead silence for what felt like hours. He stared at the handwritten letter. He stared at Martha. He looked over at Annie, who was crying silently in the corner of the room. Then, for the very first time in decades, Arthur felt hot tears break and stream down his own face. "Martha," he rasped, his voice completely wrecked. "I came to this house to test you, to prove to myself that you were just a greedy liar, just like every other person I've ever known. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. You didn't need to be tested. You are exactly the woman my Aunt Eleanor knew you were. A woman with a heart of pure gold." He reached out and firmly grabbed her hands, which were ice cold and violently shaking. "And this inheritance? It is yours by absolute legal right. Eleanor left it to you because you earned every single cent. You took care of her when her own blood abandoned her to rot. Today, right now, we are driving straight to that bank vault. We are opening that lockbox. And you are going to take back everything that belongs to you." Martha let out a gut-wrenching sob. "But Mr. Arthur, I pawned my husband's ring. I blew my entire life savings on you. On a fake psychological test. No." Arthur cut her off, his voice commanding and ironclad. "You did not waste your money on a test. You spent your last dime doing what you knew in your soul was right. And that proves exactly the caliber of human being you are. Exactly how much did you sell that gold ring for?" $750. "I am buying it back. I will pay that pawnbroker 10 times what he gave you if I have to. You are putting that ring back on your finger today, and you are getting every single thing you deserve." At that exact moment, Joe, who had been standing by the open door witnessing the entire explosion in silence, politely cleared his throat. "Boss, if I may speak freely, Miss Martha has always been a rare breed. Every single one of us on the estate staff has known that since day one." Arthur locked eyes with his oldest friend and gave a slow nod. "You were right, Joe. I was the one who was completely blind." He turned back to face Martha. "Today is day one of a brand new life. For both of us, you are officially no longer my housekeeper. You are the sole heir to my aunt's estate, and by all rights, an incredibly wealthy woman. But infinitely more important than that, you are the person who single-handedly proved to me that real, raw goodness still exists in this world." Martha couldn't stop crying. Annie rushed across the room and threw her arms around her mother. And right there, inside that decaying house, surrounded by cheap hand-me-down furniture and cracked drywall, the entire universe shifted. Not just for Martha, but for Arthur too. Because he had walked through that rusted gate as an arrogant billionaire determined to test a working-class woman. And he was walking out as a man who had been put to the ultimate test, and he had failed it miserably. But he was walking away with a second chance to be a better man. A few hours later, the massive black limousine was gliding smoothly through the towering skyscrapers of the financial district. Inside the cabin, a heavy, reverent silence hung in the air. Martha was sitting right next to Arthur, still wearing her faded cleaning uniform, clutching that tiny brass key in her lap like it was made of fragile glass. Annie had stayed back at the house with Joe, who had promised to keep an eye on her and order them a massive 5-star takeout lunch. Arthur stared out the tinted window, totally lost in his own head. 15 years. His Aunt Eleanor had left this fortune to Martha a decade and a half ago. And for all those agonizing years, Martha had scrubbed floors, lived paycheck to paycheck, raised her daughter on food stamps, and never once found the audacity to break that seal. She never felt she was worthy. Meanwhile, he, Arthur, had been drowning in billions of dollars and toxic paranoia. The downtown bank was an absolute fortress. Floor-to-ceiling Italian marble, bulletproof glass, armed guards posted at every exit. Martha had never set foot inside a building this intimidating in her entire life. She felt microscopic, totally out of place. But Arthur gently placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Come on," he said softly. "You have every right to walk through these doors." They were instantly greeted by the branch manager, a slick middle-aged executive who practically bowed when he saw Arthur, reserving his ultimate reverence for the bank's ultra-high net worth clients. When Arthur firmly explained the situation, slapping the handwritten letter and the brass key onto the mahogany desk, the manager rapidly typed into his terminal. His eyes nearly bugged out of his skull. Safety deposit box 847, the manager stammered. Registered under the estate of Eleanor Sterling with the sole beneficiary listed as Martha Davis. The account has been sitting active and compounding since 2011. Please follow me immediately. They took the private elevator down into the subterranean vault. Walls of reinforced steel, blinding fluorescent lights, dead, absolute silence. The manager slid his master key into the lock right alongside Martha's tiny brass key. The heavy steel door of the lockbox popped open with a heavy mechanical click. Inside, it was packed. Velvet boxes, thick stacks of legal documents, wax-sealed envelopes. The manager quickly bowed out, giving them total privacy in the vault. Arthur and Martha just stood there, staring down at the contents like they had just unearthed a buried pirate treasure. Martha reached in with shaking fingers and pulled out the top envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, the cursive shaking from the frail hands of a dying woman. She started reading it out loud, and with every single syllable the tears fell faster. My dearest Martha, if you are holding this letter, it means you have finally given yourself permission to accept what you have always deserved. During the brutal final months of my life when the physical agony was unbearable and the total isolation was even worse, you were my only beacon of light. You didn't come to my estate just because I signed your paychecks. You showed up because you actually cared. You remembered my birthday when my own family didn't. You picked wildflowers from your tiny yard and put them on my nightstand. You sat on the edge of my bed and talked to me about normal, everyday things while I swallowed down bitter medications. You treated me like Eleanor, not like the miserable old bat that the rest of the Sterling family couldn't wait to put in the ground. My great-nephew Arthur visited me, yes, but it was pure manufactured obligation. I saw it burning in his eyes. He was always checking his watch, desperate to sprint out the door. He is fundamentally a good man, but he is totally blinded by corporate greed and deep, unspoken resentments. You are different. You look at people and you see their actual souls. Because of that, I am legally transferring the deed of my luxury penthouse on Park Avenue directly to you. 3 bedrooms, overlooking the skyline. A dignified home for you and your brilliant daughter. I am also leaving you a massive block of shares in the Sterling Corporation, which pay out heavy quarterly dividends, alongside a liquid checking account holding exactly $500,000. Use this fortune wisely. Go back to college if you want to. Rest your tired bones if you need to. But above all else, live without terror. You earned this. Your friend for eternity, Eleanor. When Martha read the final word, her knees completely gave out. She collapsed onto the freezing steel floor of the vault, clutching the letter to her chest, sobbing hysterically. Arthur dropped to the floor right next to her, and for the second time that day he openly wept. Not out of sadness, out of absolute suffocating shame, out of profound regret. His aunt, the woman he used to visit like it was a prison sentence, always irritated that he was wasting his valuable time, had looked right through his expensive suits and diagnosed exactly what he was. A man entirely blinded by his wealth and his own bitter resentments. "Martha," he choked out, his throat burning. "I need to beg for your absolute forgiveness." She looked up at him, her eyes bloodshot, her face totally soaked in tears. "Everything that happened this week," he confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The test, the con, me pretending to be a vagrant. I engineered the entire thing. I wanted to break you. I wanted to expose you as a fraud, just like my own daughter. But I was dead wrong. Horrifically wrong, and you paid the ultimate price for my sick paranoia. You lost your husband's ring. You almost lost your daughter to a fever. All because of my toxic ego." He shifted onto his knees on the cold vault floor, positioning himself right in front of her, one of the most ruthless, powerful billionaires in the state, kneeling on the ground in front of his cleaning lady. "Forgive me. I am begging you." Martha stared at him in dead silence for several agonizing seconds. Then, she slowly reached out her hand and gently rested it against his cheek. "Mr. Arthur," she said, her voice carrying that unshakable, soothing calm it always had. "I understand. Your daughter's vicious betrayal gutted you. It forced you to see monsters where there were only friends. Would I have done the exact same thing in your shoes? I don't know. I've never been betrayed by my own flesh and blood like that. But I know that kind of trauma makes you blind. And I know deep in my soul that you are not an evil man. You were just completely lost in the dark." She gripped his arms, helped him stand back up, and pulled him into a massive hug. Right there, in the subterranean vault of a mega bank, 2 entirely different universes violently collided. The world of the paranoid elite and the world of the ruthlessly generous working class. And inside that embrace, both of their shattered souls finally began to heal. The following weeks were a total metamorphosis. True to his word, Arthur moved heaven and earth to track down Martha's pawned ring. He walked into that sleazy pawn shop and slammed $5,000 in cash onto the glass, nearly 10 times what the gold was worth, just to ensure he personally placed it back into her hands. He deployed his army of corporate lawyers to fast-track all the bureaucratic red tape of the inheritance. The luxury Park Avenue penthouse was officially transferred into Martha's name. The high-yield stocks, the massive quarterly dividends, the $500,000 checking account, all of it cleared and secured. For the very first time since the day she was born, Martha didn't have to suffer panic attacks over her electric bill. She paid out of pocket for the absolute best private health care for Annie. She bought top-of-the-line laptops and school supplies. She was finally allowed to just breathe, to dream. But an even more seismic shift happened behind the scenes. Arthur fundamentally changed. He summoned his legal team and aggressively rewrote his entire last will and testament. Victoria and Trent were officially, legally disinherited from his empire. In a blistering, legally binding letter attached to the document, he wrote, "To the two parasites who tried to declare me legally insane to hijack my life's work, I leave you with one final lesson. Betrayal carries a devastating price tag. My entire fortune will be liquidated and distributed amongst charitable foundations, and the rare individuals who have actually proven they are worthy of holding it." A massive chunk of his billion-dollar estate was immediately diverted to establish a colossal educational trust fund for underprivileged youth. And he made absolutely certain to legally appoint Martha as the executive director of the entire foundation. She, who had spent her entire life desperately wishing she could get a college degree, who had always bled to help others, now held the keys to a kingdom that could change thousands of lives. When Arthur sat her down and handed her the legal paperwork, Martha broke down in tears all over again. But these were a totally different breed of tears. These were tears of immense purpose, of unstoppable hope. "Mr. Arthur," she stammered, overwhelmed. "I don't know if I'm qualified for this. I've never run a massive corporation in my life." "You'll learn," he replied, flashing a massive, genuine smile. "And you'll have an army of experts backing you up. You're going back to school to get that education degree you always wanted. And you are going to change the world the exact same way you changed mine. But before the dust fully settles on this incredible saga, there is a burning question that needs to be answered. Was Arthur's twisted psychological test a massive, unforgivable injustice against an innocent woman? Or do you completely understand his extreme paranoia after his own daughter tried to destroy his life? And what did you think of Martha's incredible grace in instantly forgiving him? Drop your raw opinions down in the comments below. I really want to know exactly how you would have reacted if you were in their shoes. 6 months later, life had settled into a beautiful, unshakable new rhythm. It was a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon. They were sitting inside a gritty, hole-in-the-wall diner, the kind with sticky red and white checkered tablecloths and wobbly ceiling fans spinning lazily overhead. Arthur was posted up in a corner booth, sipping a black coffee, waiting. The glass door jingled open and Martha walked in. But this was a brand new Martha. No more faded cleaning uniforms. She was wearing a sharp, elegant blouse and fitted jeans. Her hair was down, blowing in the breeze. She was lugging a heavy leather tote bag overflowing with thick college textbooks and highlighters. Her face lit up with a massive smile the second she spotted Arthur, and she hurried over to the booth. He immediately stood up to pull her into a tight hug. "How were classes today?" he asked as they slid into the vinyl booth. "Absolutely incredible." Martha beamed, her eyes sparkling with pure electricity. "We are diving deep into childhood developmental psychology. It is blowing my mind, Mr. Arthur." He smiled warmly. He loved seeing her like this, fired up, deeply fulfilled. She was in her first semester pursuing a degree in education at the state university. She had crushed the entrance exams with a score that turned heads across the campus. Annie, her daughter, was thriving in her junior year of high school, fully healthy, glowing with life, and living like royalty in the Park Avenue penthouse Eleanor had left them. She was currently hyper-fixated on getting into a top-tier pre-med program. They ordered their food: meatloaf, garlic mashed potatoes, green beans, and a side salad. Nothing gourmet, just heavy, delicious comfort food. Honest diner food. They talked about everything under the sun. About Martha's brutal midterms, About the massive new scholarship projects the educational trust was launching. About Annie's college tours. About Joe, the chauffeur, who had basically become an uncle to both of them. About life. Not once did they talk about stock portfolios, or psychological tests, or the toxic, bleeding wounds of the past. They only talked about the future, about unstoppable hope. "You know, Martha," Arthur said quietly, setting his fork down on his plate, "I spent my entire adult life violently obsessed with building a massive empire. I convinced myself that was the only metric of success. I thought power and capital were the only things that mattered. But I was dead wrong. Sitting right here with you in this cheap diner, eating meatloaf, I feel richer than I ever have in my entire life." Martha reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "True wealth," she said, her voice anchoring him to the earth, "has always been found in the souls around you, not in your bank accounts." He gave a slow nod. "You taught me that. You proved to me that it is still worth taking the risk to trust, that there are still angels walking among us. And you taught me," she replied, her eyes welling up just a bit, "that I am actually worthy, that I deserve to take up space in this world, that my dreams actually matter." They stared at each other for a long, heavy moment. It wasn't romantic love. It was something infinitely more profound. It was the absolute, unbreakable bond between two scarred souls who collided at the exact second they both desperately needed saving. Arthur had lost a biological daughter to the poison of corporate greed. But he had gained a fiercely loyal best friend for the rest of his days. And Martha had temporarily lost her dead husband's wedding ring. But she had gained an entire, beautiful future. They finished their lunch laughing out loud at a ridiculous joke Joe had cracked a few days earlier. They threw cash on the table for the bill, tipped the waitress heavily, and walked out together into the blinding afternoon sun. Life marched on. But now, for the both of them, it was an infinitely better life. A life violently injected with purpose. A life where true goodness wasn't brutally punished, but heavily, rightfully rewarded. Incredible stories like this one prove to us that true, raw human goodness never goes unnoticed by the universe. It might be delayed. It might be brutally tested. It might even get wounded in the crossfire. But in the end, it always claims its absolute victory. And when we are lucky enough to encounter it, when we spot a pure soul shining through the toxic cynicism of this world, it is our absolute duty to protect it, to honor it, and to let it change us for the better. Arthur learned the hard way. Martha taught the masterclass, and both of their lives were saved because of it. If you are hooked on stories that hit you right in the chest and prove that it is still worth fighting to be a good person in this dark world, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to officially join our family. Because as long as we have stories like this to tell, there is still unstoppable hope for every single one of us.